We are in the home stretch for Chapter 9. This should be the final video in the lecture for Chapter 9. And we are going to start off this fourth video by talking about some of the type of reports, short, informal reports that you might be called upon to do during the course of your career. And they're all identified in your textbook. They're identified in the PowerPoint slides. How you go about organizing them is explained in that material. You may be called upon, if you're sent on a trip, a business trip, to a convention, to a conference, you're often going to be asked to report on what you found at the event, what you learned at the event. Did you get information that will be helpful to your company, to your entity, to your division? And you'll be asked to report on that. You probably won't be asked to summarize everything that you did, and certainly if you went to some conventions, you might not want to report everything that you did, especially if you went to one in Vegas. But anyway, if you are sent on some type of outing, such as a trip or a convention or a conference, it is usually required that you prepare some type of memo so that you can share what you learned with the other people in your department, in your division, and with your manager. I know that in my firm, if we send someone to, say, a continuing legal education seminar, we expect them to come back, prepare a memo of what they learned in the continuing legal education seminar, and possibly do a presentation to the rest of us about what was discussed at the continuing legal education seminar. If we go to a meeting, we sometimes will have a presentation about what was discussed at the professional meeting. Not necessarily if we go to a client meeting, but say if we go to a trade association meeting, or if we go to a convention, or if we go to visit a client, we sometimes will do a memo to first off tell the managing partners what happened at the meeting or what happened with the client visit, but also to let everybody else in the firm know what that client might be doing, what activities that client might be going into. So you will need to become familiar with these types of formal memos. And the whole method is what needs to go in is laid out in the PowerPoint, is laid out in the textbook. If you are sent on a business junket, not in a negative sense, but if you are sent on a junket, you always should express thanks to management for sending you. Management does like to sort of know that people appreciate when they've been sent on a business trip or to a convention or to a conference. Those are expensive, and it is appropriate to thank management for that, and it also is appropriate to mention how much the event added to your professional knowledge, to your understanding of your work, and how you can take some of the information that you gathered and use that in your business, in your practice. You may be required by your company policy to submit travel vouchers, receipts. Often there's a separate type of reporting for the financial aspects of your trip. We're not focused necessarily in this subject in our discussion of business communications with the ins and outs of business travel accounting. We're focused more on sharing the information, the ideas that you learned. Another type of report that you will probably be asked to file in the course of your business career are progress or interim reports. If you're working on a long-term project that might have various steps along the way, or that might cover several months or maybe even several years, you will be expected periodically to file progress reports. So management knows what's going on with your project. What have you accomplished? What still needs to be accomplished? What challenges have arisen? What complications have arisen? How have you managed to work around issues that have developed? So you need to be able to speak very pointedly and very efficiently about where your project stands and what is still left to be done with your project. And those types of reports you might have to do even outside of business. If you're working in government, if you're working in your community, if you're working in an association, if you're working in an organization, oftentimes there are long-term projects going on, and you are asked to periodically report back on those and let the general membership of the organization know what is happening and know what's been achieved and what still is left to be achieved. You may be called upon to do minutes of a meeting. Now, some people might want to use a very formal style of minutes. Other people use a much more relaxed style of minutes. But there is a process for keeping minutes of a meeting, because the reason we want to keep minutes of a meeting is to record what was discussed at that meeting so that all of the back and forth is not lost. And you also have to try to identify who was present at the meeting. So it's easily ascertainable from looking at the minutes whether an important decision maker was or was not at the particular meeting, and is any decision that was made at that meeting, is it a final decision given the fact that an appropriate decision maker was not present? If the meeting minutes relate to a formal corporation or formal entity event, such as a board of directors meeting or a shareholders meeting, then if there are resolutions or any type of amendment to bylaws or organizational charter adopted, the minutes need to state those changes in the precise wording. So it's important that any type of resolution or action that's taken at a meeting be expressed in the precise language that was adopted. And it's always appropriate for the person who is preparing the minutes to identify himself or herself, so that if there are questions about the minutes, that it's clear to whom questions should be directed. If minutes are formal, they may need to be signed, but if minutes are not formal, if they are more informal, they don't necessarily need to be signed, but they do need to identify who prepared the minutes so that anybody reviewing the minutes knows to whom questions can be directed. You should by now be very familiar with the summary form of business communication, because an informal report, because you have been doing summaries of newspaper articles for me, and you need to know that, and you're beginning to understand the process of preparing a summary. A summary is not as easy as it looks, because you have to try to distill the essence of a longer piece into something that's shorter and more easily comprehensible and more easily digested by someone who might have an awful lot to read, like your typical corporate manager. You want to make sure that your summary is well organized, that it is very clear. You want to make sure that you give proper identification to what is and isn't your own particular expression, your own particular wording. You may be asked to provide an overall reaction, but for the most part, summaries are not intended to be analytical. They are intended to be informational. So you are providing a summary of a larger document, or a summary of a book, or a summary of some type of larger report, and you are not necessarily giving your opinion about it, but you are giving a distillation of what is stated in the actual report. The last type of report that we want to talk about is the justification or recommendation reports. And these are the types of reports that are going to sometimes be done in the indirect strategy, but sometimes will be done in the direct strategy. If you have determined, as we talked about early on, that this is not going to be a controversial subject, that your readers may already understand the issue, that your readers may already be in favor of what you're talking about in the report, then you can probably use the direct strategy. So you would explain the problem or need, you would announce the recommendation or solution, you would explain the benefits of the recommendation or the steps to solve the problem. You might include a discussion of the pros and the cons of each approach or the costs of each approach, and then you would conclude with a summary expressing a recommendation or a necessary course of action. This is where you believe that your audience is going to be with you with respect to your conclusion, where you're not going to have to rely on persuasion or do a lot of detailed education or explanation. That's when you would use the direct strategy. When you do need persuasion, when you do need to give your receiver an education or an explanation of the situation that's giving rise to the recommendation, then you would follow, and you would be better advised to follow the indirect strategy in preparing your justification or recommendation report. You want to refer to the problem or the issue in general terms in your subject line or title of your memo, of your report. You want to describe the problem and the need for recommendations and the need for whatever solution and suggestion that you are going to try to make. You'll try to use specific examples, supporting statistics, authoritative quotations, because you want to educate your audience. You also want to build credibility so that your audience accepts and is persuaded by the recommendations that you're going to make. You want to discuss alternative solutions. You especially start, and you start with the solution that's least likely to work to the solutions that are more likely to work. And then you promote your most promising alternative, the one that you are recommending, last. You save the best for last. And you show why your recommendation is the best. You show the advantages of your recommendation, and you show how they outweigh the disadvantages of your recommendation. You summarize your recommendation and you give appropriate action steps that need to be taken. And if you're writing to your superior and you're asking for a blessing, a consent, authorization to proceed, that should be the action item that closes out your memo, that closes out your report. You want to get the permission to move forward with your recommendation. The other type of analytical report that you might be asked to provide is a feasibility report. A feasibility report is where you look at some type of situation, some circumstance, some proposed course of action, and you determine whether or not that course of action is feasible. When you are doing a feasibility report, you want to put your recommendation up front. So you're being very direct. You announce your decision immediately. You provide an explanation for your answer. You provide a report as to why you think your approach is feasible or not feasible. You describe problems that might arise. You describe the benefits of your proposal. You calculate the costs, and especially when you're dealing with a proposal inside your business organization, costs will always be essential. And you provide information on the time frame. How long will it take to implement this course of action that you're suggesting? The last type of analytical report, and it's somewhat similar to a feasibility report, and it's a report called a yardstick report. And more or less, it's where you are comparing various alternatives against a set criteria, a set of criteria. And each of the alternatives are going to be measured against the same criteria. So you want to, it's called a yardstick because you're going to be measuring each alternative against the same criteria and trying to judge the feasibility, the appropriateness of each of the alternatives against those set criteria. You talk about the criteria. How were they developed? Why are they important? Why are they critical? And then you will evaluate each alternative against those criteria, and you draw conclusions and you make recommendations, and you provide your receiver with information about each of the alternatives so that it can be implemented once the receiver receives your report, sees your recommendation, and decides whether or not to take action. Again, you should consider closing out your yardstick report with an action item so that you can then implement whatever it is that you've decided that you're recommending in your yardstick report. That concludes our formal discussion of informal reports. We'll talk about this in class this week, and we will bring some of these topics back up again when we move into Chapter 10, dealing with formal reports. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me, either in class, in our private sessions, or you can post something in the discussion board for Chapter 9. Thank you.